Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dawn Buse, a licensed psychologist and clinical professor of neurology in the Department of Neurology at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And welcome to what is going to be a really interesting and informative webinar, Migraine and Navigating the Disability Process, sponsored by the American Migraine Foundation. I know this is going to be a great topic because this is something that we hear questions from so many people living with migraine. We have some amazing, knowledgeable, and passionate experts with us today. In fact, just before we even started, when we were getting ready, we were already talking, and we had to say, stop talking so we could start the webinar. So we have a lot to share with you. As you probably know, migraine is a chronic disease, and it has episodic manifestations for many. Attacks that happen when they happen for many, often unpredictable, painful, affect your life, take you out of the game, be it work, school, family, social, leisure, vacation, whatever you have planned, for days at a time. And some people live with more frequent migraine. Every other day, on average, is in chronic migraine, up to every day with migraine. So for some percentage of people living with migraine, it's a small percentage, but if it's you, this is really affecting your life. Some people can no longer work due to migraine. And if you're unable to work due to migraine, Social Security Disability Income, or SSDI, could provide much needed support. But unfortunately, the process to get to that approval for SSDI can often be faced with many challenges and many time delays and all sorts of hurdles along the way. So today we're going to review with you what you need to know before applying for SSDI. We'll discuss the application steps that are specific to migraine, how to appeal a denial, and every tip and trick and information we can give you to get to the best outcome possible for you. So as I mentioned, we have three very knowledgeable experts with us. I'm going to introduce them in just a moment, but we also are going to make sure we save time to hear from you. We're going to have questions and answers at the end of this presentation. So when a question pops into your mind at any time, go ahead and click on the questions tab and write your question. And then we will answer as many as possible at the end of our session. And if you feel like you still have questions after the session, or you go away and you think and questions start to percolate, as they often do, you can rewatch this program on our YouTube channel. You can go to the American Migraine Foundation website, and you can always reach out to the American Migraine Foundation at any time. We are always here for you via social media or an email through the website. So we want to help support you in any and all ways that we can. So let's get to these experts. So today we have Dr. Robert Shapiro, who is a neurologist and professor in the Department of Neurologic Sciences in Vermont. We also have Qasim Amin Nathari, a patient advocate and founder of Black Men Have Migraine Too. I've got to work with Qasim before, and it's just wonderful to hear him present his story. He has a lot of wisdom and passion, and kind of giving us some of that confidence to keep sticking with it that he's going to share with us. And then we have Stacy Monahan Tucker. She's an attorney and a founding partner at Monahan Tucker Law, and she has, I shouldn't say decades, but oodles of experience exactly in this topic. She's been on both sides of representing folks, so she knows the ins and outs from the insurance side, the ins and outs from the patient side. She has a lot to share. So let me say hi to each person one at a time, and maybe you can say to us just a little bit about why this topic is so important to you. So let's start with Stacy. Welcome, Stacy.
Hi, thank you so much, and I'm very excited to be here. I started doing this work representing the insurance companies, and 25 years ago, most of the cases I saw were pretty clear cases of fraud. Over the course of the 25 years, that started to change, and I saw more and more very clearly legitimate claims being denied, and that's when I started to feel uncomfortable with what I was doing, and I changed sides. And now I represent the insureds as they apply for disability. And while I do not specifically handle Social Security, I handle private insurance mostly through your employer. However, a big chunk of that is Social Security, so I can discuss both tonight.
Great. Thank you. We're so glad you're here with us, Stacy. Thank you for making time to be here. You're a great resource. Okay, now Mr. Qasim Nathari. I always say Qasim rhymes with awesome. Qasim, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Buse. I have lived with chronic migraine for quite some time now, and it became chronic at a certain point. The reason that this topic is really important to me is about 15 years into my journey of living alongside migraine disease, my condition began to really deteriorate. And I began to have to go through the process just as a stopgap. I said, let me apply for Social Security disability in the event that I get any worse and I'm not able to work. And I had a 3-year journey dealing with that process. So for me, anytime that I can share the realities of that process, I want to share that because I want people to be able to navigate, what can also be pitfalls surrounding that. So I'm always willing to share that, and I'm looking forward to discussing that this evening with you all.
Thank you, Qasim. So basically, you're going to share the hardships you had. So hopefully we can help people kind of overcome those hurdles, and maybe they don't have to go through such long challenges. Thank you. And then we have Dr. Robert Shapiro, who you've seen on webcasts here before with the American Migraine Foundation. Dr. Shapiro, you are always a passionate and knowledgeable individual to hear talk about this topic. Tell us a little bit about your experience in this area and why you're so passionate about it.
I've been engaged in advocacy in this area specifically for about a decade. I became aware of certain very specific concrete inequities that exist for people who have disabling migraine in their ability to make legitimate claims for the insurance that they have paid into their payroll to have in case of disability. And so I've been very, very engaged on this including speaking directly with the people at Social Security about it, and as I'll tell you a bit later, making some progress in terms of the guidances that people will have for claims.
Well, thank you. Okay, we've got our introduction, so let's jump back to Qasim. You started telling us your story. Tell us a bit more about your experience and what you've learned along the way, what you want to share with listeners.
Absolutely. Thank you again. I began the process by already being informed that it was going to be a tedious and arduous process. So I went in expecting the worst and praying for the best, of course, like we do in most engagements. So when I applied initially, I was able to get a very helpful and forthcoming representative from Social Security who told me right from the outset that you're going to be denied the first time. And that information was consistent with what I had been told by others who went through process for things other than migraine. I would add that. So after I was denied the first time, I immediately went and I retained an attorney because the situation was so tenuous with me that I wasn't going to take the chance of going through a second and maybe a third denial, and then it goes on and on and on. So I was living in New Jersey, and in the New York area, there were some prominent firms that handled disability cases specifically. So I engaged one of those firms, and even with that representation, it still took me 3 years for the process to play itself out. So from the initial time that I filed in 2011, it wasn't until 2014, the year that I turned 50 years old, that I got an approval. And the approval, I'll say this, then we can probably flesh this out a little later, more later on in the discussion. The approval actually was given as a partially favorable, which means for the layperson, and I'm sure that Attorney Stacy will go into this in more detail, it means that they approve you for the disability, but they penalize you for some income that you earned during the time. So during that 3-year period, I had one situation where I had a very small consulting contract. I mean, it wasn't anything of real substance at all. But because I had any kind of income, they took a whole year away from the 3 years that I ultimately would have gotten. So instead of getting paid retroactively for 3 years from 2011 to 2014, I only got paid for 2 years. So the process is very, tedious. And what I will say right off the bat, have all your documentation in place. Record keeping is key. So make sure that all the notes that your doctor has made with you on these visits, when you go and you complain, quote unquote, about migraine and all these other challenges, all this documentation needs to be in place. And that was definitely helped the process as we go on. And I'm sure Dr. Shapiro will talk about that a little more. So I'll leave that space to him.
Thank you. Okay. So, wow, you went with an attorney, still took 3 years, and you ended up getting penalized and coming away with 2 years of support. But you got there. You got to that.
Yes.
You got across that finish line there. So, Stacy, what should we learn about the experience that Qasim had and that others can learn from?
Qasim's experience is unfortunately very common. The advice that his lawyer gave him is advice that my clients are told all the time, which is it is unlikely that you are going to be awarded Social Security at the initial appeal level. There are 3 levels. First, you make your initial appeal, then you file a motion for reconsideration, which is basically an appeal, and then you are put in front of an administrative judge. And that administrative judge is usually where most people get awarded. It can take usually between 1.5 and 2 years, although stories like Qasim's are pretty common where it can take up to 3 years. That's not that unusual. Those courts are very backed up, and a lot of it's just delay trying to get a hearing. That, unfortunately, is a big part of the process. I will say the closer you are to age 65, the more likely Social Security is to approve your claim in the first round.
Okay, good points. Okay, Dr. Shapiro, Bob, do you want to kind of add in some thoughts at this point?
Sure. So Social Security has actually published some data about what the pros and the cons are of being somebody who is experiencing disability or impairments from migraine and making claims for it. And their data are not so recent. They're from about 20 years ago. But at that time, only 0.3% of claimants were people who were claiming for migraine. It was a very, very small fraction relative to the very high prevalence of disability in the population due to migraine. It's about a 17-fold difference. And of those people who made a claim on the basis of migraine, if you look at what's called the initial allowance rate, which is what Stacy was mentioning as the first level of looking at this, or people who, of all people who were making claims for SSDI, 46% of them were able to get it on the initial allowance rate. And for people with migraine, it was half that, 23%. So people were discouraged from making claims, and when they made claims, they had a much lower likelihood of actually succeeding on the initial allowance. We don't have any data since then that Social Security has published to give us an idea about whether things have improved or not.
Stacy, are there, I know Qasim said to have things in a row. Are there ducks to have in a row that can really be helpful for ensuring you're going to have at least a shorter process, a more likely to be successful process?
Absolutely, especially when you have a invisible disability like migraines, and migraines are far from the only ones, so Social Security is somewhat used to dealing with this situation, but having your own documentation of your experience is very helpful. Migraine doctors are probably already telling you to consider keeping a headache journal or diary that helps track when you're getting your migraines and headaches, what might be triggering them, when do you feel them, is there any sort of a pattern that you can identify. Not only will this help your doctor, it helps Social Security see what you are going through, because obviously you're not seeing your doctor every day. Your medical records aren't going to show how you're feeling on a day-to-day basis. You need to create that record yourself. You can also make sure up front when you're applying that your doctor supports you. A surprising number of people file claims for disability without thinking to confirm that their doctor agrees. Without your doctor's willingness to sign off on the forms required for disability, your application is essentially dead in the water. So before you apply, you want to make sure that your doctor supports you. If your doctor does not support you, you need to decide whether your doctor is correct and you need to reevaluate, or if you want to get a second opinion. You can absolutely do that. Just be aware that the more you doctor hop, the more the Social Security will raise its eyebrows, and be aware of that as well. So that can cut both ways. But it is always an option, and making sure that your doctor supports you is absolutely the first step in any sort of application for a disability.
I'm going to ask Dr. Shapiro his advice on this, but real quick, Brandy wrote in and said, my neurologist is aware and trying to help me get SSDI. It seems in filling out forms there may be certain buzzwords. Is this true? And if so, can anyone share them?
So process for qualifying for SSDI is very formulaic. It's kind of mirrors or mimics what we all think about the bureaucratic processes which kind of invest everything about our government. And specifically, it's important to recognize that SSDI is not any kind of government handout. People think about it in that way, that people are unqualified and you're just asking for money from the government. It really is a mandated insurance that everybody has to pay from their payroll. It's deducted automatically, and you have to have done it for a long enough period of time. You have to have at least 40 qualifying units, which take at least 10 years of employment to achieve. And by that time, you've actually stashed a fair bit of money by the government to stash that money invested basically to be able to support you if you needed a disability. And then when it comes time for you to apply, there's also a very formulaic process that goes into them deciding whether or not you qualify. And it's called sequential evaluation, and it has 5 very specific steps. And at the first step, you have to prove that you can't work. It's called substantial gainful activity. And the second step is you have to prove that you have what's called a medically determinable impairment. It's a mouthful. It means that you have an impairment which is severe enough to qualify. And specifically and inequitably, unfairly, Social Security will not accept, and this is based upon the laws that Congress passed, the statutes, Social Security will not accept your symptoms as evidence that you have a disability or an impairment. And why is this important? Because the diagnostic criteria for migraine and other primary headache disorders, but particularly migraine, really have no physical examination finding or laboratory finding which is specific to confirm you've got it. So if you have migraine and disabilities, all you have are what you can tell people, that is your symptoms. And so at that step, proving a medically determinable impairment, people are at a disadvantage who are claiming for migraine. And then at the third step, you have to compare your level of impairment to a model level of impairment for your particular disease or condition. And that's called the listing of impairments of the Blue Book. And there's no listing for migraine. So Social Security insists that you compare your impairments to people who have epilepsy, which is not a fair comparison at all. So in order to be able to navigate this through the advocacy work that we've been doing, we were able to prompt Social Security for the first time to issue a guidance document for people who have headache disorders like migraine or cluster headache about how, given these inequities, how they view applying for Social Security disability insurance and what would qualify. I mean, how do you go about doing this? So at this step where you only have symptoms, you have to be able to have an advocate, a specific person who is called an acceptable medical source, meaning your doctor or psychologist or nurse practitioner, somebody who Social Security has designated as being qualified to say that they've observed you having migraine. Now, if you only have symptoms and you can only describe what you're experiencing, then that's kind of meaningless at some level. But they insist you do that. And that can be something as simple as during a migraine attack, if the doctor turns the light off and you say that you feel better with the light off during the attack, well, then that would be a qualifying behavior example of that. Or if you're having confusion at some point in understanding directions or the like. And so it's critical, as Stacy mentioned, critical, you don't even start the whole process unless you have a doctor or other acceptable medical source, so-called AMS, who will be your advocate here, who will be your advocate to find that you do have the diagnosis based upon the agreed upon diagnostic criteria that are accepted, that they've observed one of your episodes where you're experiencing migraine symptoms and can attest that you have had a behavior change or something which is observable to the extent that it is observable. It's absolutely mandatory. You can't get any further unless your doctor is able to make that sort of a statement. Under some circumstances, a third party might be able to make the observation, but then your doctor would have to attest that the third party had made that observation. And then your doctor also
key to have a medical professional partner on board. And while we would think people experiencing frequent debilitating migraine would have a healthcare professional they're working with, a lot of the research I've done and Dr. Shapiro, you and I have done together in the Overcome study looking at 60,000 people with migraine in the U.S. shows that, in fact, only about half of people living with migraine are being cared for by a healthcare professional. So some people listening, for whatever reason, may not be actively seeing their doctor. Some people may have seen a doctor in the past and they kind of gave up. They didn't feel like treatments were helpful. They felt like they have to live with it. Or maybe migraine has gotten worse over time and it's time to go back in. So it sounds like getting that medical professional partner on board is going to be important, and establishing some regular visits with that person, a diary, documentation of frequency, symptoms, what did it cause you to miss, work, school, other types of activities, is going to be really important. And it sounds like this is a bit of a time-consuming process.
It's very time-consuming, and everything you said about documentation is also the other fundamental piece of this. So your doctor also has to attest to what therapies or treatments have been applied, their success or failure, what tests have been done to exclude other conditions which might look like this, and all of that has to be packaged together. And you have to actually have your doctor be your advocate in this, or you really can't get any further. So it's really necessary to find somebody who will work with you on it.
Mm-hmm. Then it may not be the first visit. It may take some numbers of visits for that healthcare professional to feel like they've gotten to know you and your case, and they've seen your pattern over weeks or months and seasons and are ready to, in fact, document and go down this path with you. And, you and I both see patients, and it's understandable that we do need to get to know people and their history, which may take a couple visits.
That's true, and it's also true that not all doctors understand that the stereotypical way that you'll find on the internet migraine is supposed to look like, with people squinting and holding their head. People with chronic migraine just don't look like that at all. That's a fiction. So you have to develop a trust with your healthcare provider that they understand, even though you don't look like you have an impairment, you may not be thinking as clearly as you should, or you may have fatigue, or there may be any number of other impairments which may arise, vertigo or dizziness, and so on, difficulty processing information if there are loud noises. There's a long list of things which people can experience without there being any visible change.
Well, many people with very frequent migraine are masters at, well, let's just do this, let's get out there, we've got to go, we've got to do it, and really pushing themselves through a lot of things because they feel that they have to, despite really being impaired, being in pain and having other symptoms. So we on the call and everyone listening knows this, but it sounds like it's quite a hurdle to translate that to the people making the decisions at these agencies. And the other thing that can happen with migraine is, as we all know, is that migraine can kind of wax and wane. You can have better and worse months, better and worse days of the month, weeks of the month. seasons of the year. You can have better and worse times in your life. And people who have chronic migraine typically started from an episodic or less frequent. It's very rare to start right off into a persistent daily headache. Thank goodness that's rare. So I'm wondering also if that is part of the reluctance and the challenge of documenting and proving the case that you now at this point in time are too disabled to keep a job, to be able to commit to that you will be there X days and X number of times, and that you will not call out, you will not be sick. So does everyone find that is part of the challenge to explain that and confirm and convince people making the decisions?
Very much so. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Stacy.
Very much so. That is definitely something that SSA or insurance companies are looking at when you're applying for disability. What they're looking at is whether or not you can hold down a job. They're looking at if you are too disabled to come to a job and do that work every day. They have very specific things they're looking for in terms of restrictions and limitations. And those are the words they use. They want to know what restrictions your doctor has put upon you and what limitations your doctor has put upon you. With something like migraine that can wax and wane so dramatically, it's really important to make sure that your doctor is aware of that language that Social Security or insurance companies will be looking for, and to frame what you can and cannot do in that way. So saying that you cannot, with consistency, sit and focus and provide high levels of cognitive work, especially if you have a more cognitive job, or lifting and 20 pounds of heavy things if you are working on a dock with migraines, for example. All consistency is what will really need to be focused on there, because you're not always going to be able to say, I can do this sometimes. I can't do it all the time is the problem. And that's one of the things I wanted to emphasize in your papers. Never say never. Don't say I can never do something, because one of the things that I also recommend is getting off social media. And the reason I recommend this is that Social Security and the insurance companies are looking. And if you say, I can never go outside on a sunny day, and you post pictures of yourself outside frolicking in the sun, they will call you on that. I have sat, when I was on the other side, I have gone through people's headache diaries and compared them day by day to what they posted on social media, and used that to create the narrative that the headache diary was inaccurate.
Wow,
So,
what a good point. What a good point. And often when people live with a chronic illness, they do try and show those good days. I went to my child's school concert. I went to my kid's soccer game. I made it to the grocery store. They may not even be frolicking. They may have gone out to, buy their groceries, and yet if it looks like it can be used against them. So that's a great point, Stacy. Thank you. We have so many good questions coming in. Let's go to a lightning round, okay? We've got a lot of questions, so I'm gonna read out questions and we'll give each one a pretty quick answer. Okay, so Elizabeth said, I'm currently on state-sponsored SDI, which ends mid-February 2024. How far in advance should I begin the process of applying for SSDI? Do I wait until it expires?
Do not wait, apply immediately. There's no reason not to, and it will take a long period of time. It'll be granted retroactively. So you want to apply now, because it could easily take 1 to 2 years.
Okay. She also asked, do you recommend engaging an attorney with your original application or only after you're denied the first time?
You should engage with the original application. It's actually very inexpensive to get a Social Security attorney. Their wages are limited by federal law. They can get at most the lower of 25% of the back benefits owed, or $7,000. So, as others have noted, it's an enormous amount of work to do this. Let someone else handle it for you, especially so that you can focus on your own health and not feeling overwhelmed and stressed out by this on top of everything else.
And I would say to you, Elizabeth, because I also went through that process that Stacy just explained, definitely don't delay. and definitely I would engage from the outset, and which is what helped me tremendously, because just the mountain of things you're going to have to go through, it just makes it better if you engage an attorney right from the very beginning and let them be on that journey with you throughout the process.
All right, thank you both. Good answer. Leona says, I finally got court certified as fully favorable for my disability, but with SSO denied my SSDI payment by saying that I do not have enough work credits or my husband earns too much. But now I'm separated with my husband. I still get denied because I have not been working for many, many years since I often got laid off due to my progressive condition. What should I do?
Unfortunately, go ahead, Dr. Shapiro.
So my understanding is that you can only accrue 4 of those credits per year. That's the maximum, and you need to have a minimum of 40 credits, and at least half of them have to be in the last 10 years. So they will, and correct me if I'm wrong, Stacy, they'll just stop you in your tracks if you don't meet the first stage, which is the accumulated credits for this. And that I don't think is an appealable issue. I could be mistaken.
That is absolutely correct. There's really nothing you can do. There is something called supplemental social security income that you can apply for. You have to have very little to no work history, and your income needs to be quite low. Also, I believe there's a cap on it of $700 to $800 a month. All of these are intended to be supplemental sources of income, including SSDI itself. One thing that a lot of people don't realize, if you were working as you needed to have been at some point to apply for Social Security, and you quit your job because you're having a hard time managing it because of your migraines and your illness, and later you realize I'm disabled, you can make a retroactive claim through your employer, even if you've left your employer. Most states embrace a doctrine called notice prejudice, which means you don't have to be currently employed by them unless the insurance company can prove that they're prejudiced by the late notice. So Qasim, for example, he sounds like he applied about 2 years after he left his full-time position. He might not have been aware of this, but at that point he could have made a claim under his prior insurance through his prior employer. Most people, especially if their employer has 50 employees or more, offer some type of short and long-term disability benefit. Depending on the employer, it can be anywhere from 50% to 67% of your income. That tends to be a lot more than what Social Security is going to pay you. So if you are in that situation, you don't have to be working right now. You can make a retroactive claim. Obviously, the further out it is, the harder it's going to be to make. But let's say you left a year ago and you didn't realize at the time that you were going to be disabled for so long with your migraines. You can make a claim.
There's a couple questions that dovetail onto this. So Hunter says, my daughter's 19. She's never been able to work and couldn't finish school. Is she eligible for SSDI?
I actually looked this up because I was worried about the question. And yes, if before age 24, she needs at least 6 credits. So she needs to have worked for essentially a year and a half. If she has not, then she's not going to be eligible for SSDI. She may be eligible for SSI, which is the Supplemental Security Income.
Okay, and Lauren asked a similar question. I've read that with SSDI, you have to have worked before. How much will this apply for SSI rather than SSDI? I've never worked before due to my migraines. I can't even begin.
She will need to look at how little she's worked, and Social Security and the Social Security attorney can help her more with this, but she'll have to look at that and also her income. They have very strict income limits. So if she is receiving income from another source, then that's something that Social Security will look at.
What kind of limits are we talking about? I remember Qasim said doing a very small consultancy project and being penalized.
I don't know the exact numbers, but my understanding is it's quite low. Okay. For $10,000 to $15,000, okay. Possibly less. So be aware.
Okay. I'll be totally transparent. I know we have a bunch of questions, but I'll say this, Stacy, you hit it on the head. My consulting contract, it was exactly $10,000 that I made from that contract, and because over a 1 year period, I made $10,000 in 2012. They denied me for that entire year.
An entire year.
Right. And to that last questioner who said that their daughter, is very young and, is not going to have much in terms of credits. And Stacy will attest to this. It's not, you really would be surprised how you can have credits that you don't know about. Because when I looked at my earnings statement, when I first applied, I saw that I was paying into Social Security from my first job at 14.
Okay.
So I had money that was deducted from my paychecks from my first job that I used to have after school when I was 14 years old. So for every year, you have a certain amount of money based on what you make. Obviously, that's withheld. And that money, by the time I got to be where I was 50, when I won the case, all those years were there. So I had a lot of quarters to work with. So for that young person who may have been working since high school maybe and can't work now after college, they may have the credits. So that's something that they need to definitely have their attorney look into. Exactly.
Summer job or something. Qasim, yep. I'm so curious. What were you doing when you were 14? What was your first job?
I worked for the city used to have these summer youth programs, and they would hire you to work for the summer. So you pay taxes just like, an adult. And then I had another job where I actually worked in a fast food restaurant. And they actually took all these taxes out the check. So when I went at the earnings statement, I looked at the first year and I did the math. I said, wow, I was 14 when I started paying into this. So I really, at that point, Stacy, at that point, I really felt that I was entitled to my money because I said, I've been paying since I was 14. I need my money.
Exactly. And I like that Stacy reframed this and Bob reframed this too, that I think Bob said, we're not kind of asking the system to pay. This is money you earned, put into a savings the government saved for you, but it's your earnings. So yeah. Okay. Karen has a good question. I'm self-employed. I've not had to close my business, but my ability to work is diminished. Any thoughts?
My first question would be, if you're self-employed, did you ever purchase your own disability insurance policy? Because those are tailored for people who are self-employed, and they look at the income very differently, and it can be very beneficial. If you haven't gotten one, you may want to consider getting one now if you are still working, because what it will do is look at your income at the time you get it, and there is a pre-existing condition limitation that will affect you for at least a year, but after a 1 to 2 year period, if you can keep working for that long, they are no longer able to hold a pre-existing condition against you, at which point you could make a claim for your migraine disability. I'm not sure how long you plan to be working at a reduced rate, but that is an option you have. My understanding is it's difficult to get Social Security while working a reduced amount, although I don't actually have a lot of experience with that. Dr. Shapiro may know more.
My understanding is that at this first step in the sequential evaluation, you have to be able to claim that you do not have substantial gainful activity, that you actually are precluded, you can't work. That's like the first thing. If you are working at all, then you won't be able to qualify to move on. And for the next step, which is proving you have a medically determinable impairment, you have to be able to make the claim that this will last, or has already lasted, a period of 12 months. So the projection is that this is going to be continuing. Now, to get to this issue about intermittent symptoms or impairments which come and go, you have to prove that you have impairments while you have migraine. That doesn't mean you have migraine symptoms every day. This is where, in an odd way, the fact that Social Security insists on you comparing your impairments to those with people who have epilepsy, there's an understanding that between seizure attacks for people who have epilepsy, they may have no symptoms whatsoever. And so you do not have to, and this is kind of affirmed in law, that you don't have to have continuous impairments to be sufficiently impaired to not be able to perform the job that you had or any other job in the economy. So you have to reach a certain threshold of numbers of days where you have sufficient enough impairment to keep you from being a reliable employee to be able to meet your obligations to your employer.
Thank you. Okay, so
I believe the income limitation again comes into play there, though, because if she's working part-time, then if she brings in too much money, even if she's determined to have symptoms consistent with disability, she may not qualify based on that. One thing I wanted to make sure people know is the Social Security website. You can create your own account just by putting in your Social Security number and your name, and you can see the number of work credits you have there, and you can see what you get an estimate of what your payment would be, and it will give you all the information about the limits on how much money you can make. That is a great place to go and find out what your specific situation would be.
That's a great tip.
That's perfect. One other thing that there's a misunderstanding about, if you qualify for SSDI, that is not a permanent thing. It's not a permanent thing in the sense that you may find therapies which allow you to have substantially relieved your symptoms of migraine, and you may feel that you're very much equipped to have a full-time job and you don't need SSDI. And SSDI also is something which is continuously evaluated. Every several years, you have to reestablish that your impairments are still active. And finally, there is a practice to be able to start to work as you are receiving SSDI, as you're moving away from having qualifications for SSDI. Social Security is not discouraging you from actually having some work. And there are specific regulations about it. I'm not authoritative about that. But people tend to think, well, once you've been on SSDI, that changes your status forever. It's actually not as permanent as most people think that it's true.
Interesting. Nicole asked something along these lines. She said, can someone explain if the continuing disability review is standard for chronic migraine every 3 years, or does this review vary per individual?
It's standard for everyone, regardless of the disability. Basically, it's a check-in with your doctors to see if their opinion has changed. Dr. Shapiro may have seen more variation in the amount of time. I'll tell you that private insurance often checks in every 6 months, and it only goes to a 1 year to a 3 year period when you're very obviously seriously disabled with something that they have no question about.
Okay, great to know. Thank you. Stephanie asked kind of a big question. What meaningful policy changes need to happen to improve this process, and what advocacy is being done now, and what small wins do you think need to happen to make change?
A deep breath on that. So try to be as succinct as I can. We've been working on this very, very actively for over a decade, and one of the first things we attempted to do was to actually submit a candidate listing for migraine headache disorders for this listing of impairments, so that people with migraine would have a fair way for their impairments to be compared against a standard. And the listings are revised once every generation. So they were revised in 2016, and previously they had been revised in 1985, and probably they'll be revised again in like 2050 or something. And I'm not really being facetious. It's quite likely. So there are only a few chances to actually change the listings, and we put in tremendous effort to change the listings in 2016 when the regulations were made, called the rulemaking process, and they refused to do it. And they didn't really give us a justification. We continue to work in alignment with the attorneys who represent claimants for SSDI, called National Organization for Social Security Claimants Representatives, or NOSCR. And we were able to push Social Security to issue what's called a Social Security ruling. So this is a guidance document, which is not really law, but it's recognized by administrative law judges as being the appropriate guidance, which is what I was quoting in terms of what was needed to be able to qualify under the current regulations. And I was not satisfied that Social Security was really playing fair, in denying adding a listing because of the great prevalence of migraine. So I filed a Freedom of Information Act request to find out what the conversations were, get the emails to reveal this. And through a 5-year process, they refused and they refused, and I sued them. And I went to court, in district court, and it got appealed to the Second Circuit in New York. And I don't think I'm going to get any documents because it's really hard to do this. But there are people, just so you know, who are keeping on top of this. And the Alliance for Advocacy has seen this as a critical civil rights issue for people with migraine.
And I just have to say this, real quickly, in the advocacy space that I work in with a lot of organizations, and like Dr. Shapiro just mentioned, Headache on the Hill, this is why consistent, multifaceted advocacy is so very important, because of what the questioner asked about what kind of legislation is very key. And I got to tell you, Dr. Shapiro, you're actually, from your lawsuit, when I first read about it, you're one of my heroes. Because, no, honestly, because there's people in the advocacy community, it takes the patient, it takes attorneys, it takes doctors, it takes literally a whole village to continue with the advocacy that needs to happen around legislation. And what Dr. Shapiro did was groundbreaking, and we need more people to be, more doctors to be as bold and courageous as he is. And I'm not just saying that because we're on camera together. I mean that. So we appreciate you.
Well, thank you. I also would say that we need advocates like you who can testify and provide their own testimony about what life is like to live with this disease, which is invisible. So thank you as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for being here. I completely agree that you are both inspiring and important and have moved, as you said, Dr. Shapiro and others, Qasim, have dedicated a huge portion of his professional and personal life to advocating for people living with migraine, and it's always inspiring. I'm always inspired by him, love working with him, love his passion. And Qasim, you are so important to share your story and be transparent and let others learn from the hardships you went through is so terrific. And Stacy, we're so happy to have you as a resource, helping us navigate this process. You know the ins and outs so well. So we still have a few more questions, but we've reached the end of our time. But we did cover a lot of the topics. We do have some specific questions, but hopefully what we've shared has been helpful. I really enjoyed the engagement from everyone. Thank you so much to our listeners, our attendees. You are very important in the process. Keep voicing your opinions, your concerns, your needs. Keep pushing forward. Keep advocating for yourself. Or if you are listening because you have a loved one with migraine, advocate for that person. As we close, is there any tips that have come to your brains here, our three experts, as we kind of let them percolate? Any closing? I want to give each of you a chance to make a closing statement. Dr. Shapiro, let's start with you.
Just in terms of tips, there is specific language which Social Security has used and quoted in terms of looking or clarifying impairments, which I think if it's included in your doctor's report or your employer's testimony, etc., it's probably going to be helpful. And specifically, it's concentrating, persisting, or maintaining pace of your activities. This really relates to the fact that during migraine, your processing, your brain processing could be much impaired. Your ability to follow instructions, complex directions could be impaired. That could be a very temporary thing. Because between migraine attacks, it may not be true. But this specific phrase, concentrating, persisting, or maintaining pace of activities, is something that comes up over and over again in the Social Security's listing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all of these great tips. Who else has a closing statement, recommendation, one more piece of advice you want to give?
Mine would be to document everything, to recognize that as you are trying to keep working and trying to move forward, to plan for the future. If you're currently working, find out if your company offers disability insurance, if you've left work because of your symptoms, or if you've been let go because you weren't able to meet their expectations because of what's going on. You can still make a claim under your private insurance, which will pay a great deal more than your Social Security. So be aware of these things and look into it. Social Security is important, but it's intended to be supplemental. And so look into all of the options available to you to find out how you can best support yourself while focusing on your health.
Excellent. Thank you. Qasim, any closing thoughts for us?
Yeah, I have many, but I will leave with this one. If you do find yourself, for our listening audience, at the point where you do have to file and you engage an attorney, I would say do not engage an attorney and then become a spectator. You need to stay engaged with your attorney, and you need to stay engaged and connected to your doctors, because no one can advocate for you better than you. So stay connected to them. You don't have to be, feel that you're being overly pushy. A good lawyer and a good doctor will understand your need to stay connected. And by doing that, that's only going to help the process and help you get a more favorable outcome in the long run.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for engaging and listening. I'm going to put on my psychologist hat for a moment. And for my closing thought, I want to say something that I've learned from people with migraine who've gone through this process. It's a long process. It can be emotionally exhausting. It can be hard on you and your family members and your loved ones and other people around you in your community. And often, please don't be surprised if even when you have the success of receiving whichever goal is your end point, like getting approval for your SSDI, it's going to be a bittersweet moment, because you may be also grieving the loss of the career or the life path that you had trained for, that you're passionate about, that you've spent so many years of your life working towards, or like the father who asked about his younger daughter, a career path that she's not engaging on. So this is an emotionally stressful journey, as well as time, finances, and everything else. So be gentle on yourself, be caring and supportive of each other. Know that this is a hard process, but you will get through it. And all of us here on the call, all of us at the American Migraine Foundation are here to help support you through that. So we're going to upload this on our YouTube channel, which means that your questions are going to help many, many other people who listen. So thank you for that. And we really appreciate you being here. Come back to the American Migraine Foundation with your questions. We're always here for you. Reach out to us on social media or email us on our website, and we will always be here for you. Thank you, everybody.